This is the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. And now, Rebecca Larson.
Welcome to episode 117. And as the voice guy said, I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. On today's episode, Dr. Linda Porter joins us again. Now, the last time she was on, we chatted about Queen Mary I, Catherine Parr, and Mary Queen of Scots. Oh, and we also talked about some Stuarts as well. So if you want to check it out, I believe that was episode 84. But today, Dr. Porter has returned to discuss with us her newest subject, Margaret Tudor. But this time, instead of answering my questions, she's answering yours. So these are the ones that you submitted on social media for Ask the Expert. Now, if you want to ask our experts a question, be sure to follow Tudors Dynasty on social media. So you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you're an expert on the subject and you are an author or historian or a PhD student, maybe a professor, and you would love to participate on the show, please contact me through social media, or you can email me at rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com. Now, I'm currently in the planning stages for my next season of interviews, and I'm keeping my mind wide open for topics outside of the Tudors. So think more medieval and possibly more Stuarts as well. Because, let's be honest, there is far more to history than just the scandalous Tudors. And really to understand them, it's best to look at their past for the answers. Before we jump into Ask the Expert, I'd like to thank my newest patrons, Becky, Cecilia T., Deborah R., and Kendall C. In addition, a huge thank you to all of my existing patrons. You know, you guys, some days I get overwhelmed with all of the support that I've received since I began this in 2017, and it really does make me emotional sometimes. It's what keeps me going, so please continue to communicate with me about what you like and you don't like, because while it's fun for me, this show is for you and your friends, so be sure to tell your friends about it as well. Okay, enough about me. Let's learn more about Henry VIII's elder sister, Margaret Tudor, on Ask the Expert.
And now, Ask the Expert.
Welcome, everyone, to Ask the Expert. I'm your host, Steph Stohrer, and I'm so happy to introduce you to today's guest. Here to discuss Margaret Tudor is author and historian Dr. Linda Porter. Welcome.
Hello, Steph. Happy to talk to you.
So as you know, we take our questions from our listeners and our social media followers. So today in particular, people are extremely interested in Margaret's personal relationships. So we're going to start off with our first question from Crystalline, a listener who wonders how she got along with her paternal grandmother, for whom she was named Margaret Beaufort.
I think Margaret Beaufort was an important influence on Margaret Tudor, her granddaughter, probably an equal influence with Margaret's parents, and particularly her mother, Elizabeth of York. Obviously, Margaret took an interest in all of her grandchildren, but I think particularly the younger ones who were all together and brought up together in various palaces outside London in the southeast of England. Prince Arthur was away at Ludlow in the Welsh Marches, and I don't think Margaret Beaufort ever had much to do with him, except at his christening and at his wedding to Catherine of Aragon. But the younger children she would have visited and seen fairly frequently. And her grandmother, as a woman who had been married so very young and given birth at an almost ridiculously young age, would have been an important figure in Margaret's childhood. And I think she became even more so after the unexpected and tragically early death of Margaret's mother, Elizabeth of York, in 1502. Because, of course, by that time, Margaret was technically Queen of Scots. She had been betrothed and gone through the sort of proxy marriage ceremony in London at the end of her 12th year, which was the minimum legal requirement age for a girl to marry in those days, or at least, to begin what would be a legitimate marriage. I mean, some children were married much younger than that, but most of those marriages were actually family connections which might or might not turn into a real marriage. But Margaret had taken her vows. She had spent most, but not all, of the year after her proxy marriage with her mother. But on her mother's death, which was within only a few months of when Margaret was due to go to Scotland, that particular journey was postponed for several months, I think probably to give Margaret time to get over the shock of her mother's death. And during those months, her grandmother was obviously an influential figure and support. And it was from her grandmother's home of Collie Weston in Northamptonshire. In fact, it's just south of Lincolnshire, so sort of in the East Midlands, that Margaret set off in July of 1503 to begin her long journey north to her actual wedding with James IV of Scotland. So Margaret's piety, her interest in cultural things, and her interest in the royal family as a unit, I think would have been important influences on Margaret as a child growing up.
Okay, and now what about her sister Mary? Douglas Breeden. Hi, Douglas. He's a listener that writes in almost every time, so we're happy to have our familiar names here. What about her sister Mary, particularly before and after her marriage to Charles Brandon? What was their relationship like?
Well, when they were children, it was one of an older sister with a younger sister, I think. I mean, they were brought up together until the point of time in which Margaret became Queen of Scots. And from the year between her proxy marriage and her departure for Scotland, Margaret probably spent more time with her mother and grandmother than she did with Mary. And there was quite an age gap. You know, Margaret was born in 1489, Mary not until 1496. So it would have been very much that of an elder sister with a younger sister. Both of them would have at least known of Charles Brandon when they were children. He would have first come to their attention as a participant in the jousts and tournaments after the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur. But they were both children at the time and would probably have taken no more notice of him than they would of any other courtier at the time. When Margaret went to Scotland, she lost much of her contact with her family, of course. Mary was left in England while various marriage arrangements were pursued for her, including one with the man who became Emperor Charles V, but nothing actually came of that. And the sisters probably exchanged letters, but if they did, we don't have any that survived. When Margaret's husband, James IV, was killed at the Battle of Flodden, she was in communication with her sister, who, of course, went on to become very briefly Queen of France in her marriage to Louis XII. And they were sort of supportive letters at the time. But Margaret didn't see Mary again between 1503 and 1516, when she was in London for a bit over a year after she had fled from Scotland because of the political troubles there. So their relationship seems to have been largely a good one, as far as we can tell. I don't think there was any kind of particular rivalry involved in it, because both had been queen consorts in major European countries. I mean, arguably Mary in a more important and influential one than Margaret, but Mary's tenure as Queen of France was so brief that although she always kept the title of the French Queen afterwards, it didn't have a great deal of meaning, really, apart from reinforcing her status. The sisters did spend time in each other's company between 15, 16 and 17 while Margaret was back in London. Thereafter, I don't think we know anything about their relationship. While Margaret was keen to maintain a political presence in Scotland, Mary doesn't seem to have been so keen to retain any kind of meaningful role in England, other than that as the Duchess of Suffolk and the King's youngest sister. So while I don't think there was any animosity between them, we really can't say very much about their relationship in the years between Margaret's return to Scotland in 1517 and Mary's death in 1533. Mary has always seemed to me to be someone who, while not exactly wanting to take a back seat, enjoyed the life of a country lady and bringing up her children in Suffolk. She did come to court, I think, with decreasing frequency. And of course, she disapproved of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, but she died not very long after it. So the sisters would have lost touch completely I say completely by the early 1530s. They may have corresponded, but again, we don't know, and certainly there isn't any surviving evidence of it. But it was an apparently positive relationship for much of the time that they knew each other and were in each other's company.
Speaking of her sister Mary, Mary was actually unfortunately known, or seems to have the reputation of, the favorite of their brother, Henry VIII. Do you know why this was, and why do you think it wasn't Margaret?
I don't know how well-founded that reputation is, in fact. It's merely probably that Mary spent more time in Henry's company, ultimately, than Margaret had ever done. If it's true, then one possible reason, I think, actually goes back to the time when Margaret was Queen of Scots, but still living in England. And of course, during that period, because she was a queen, her brother would have had to give deference to her. She was a more important person than him in the hierarchy of things. And it has been said, though, for the life of me, it's one of these things that you've read somewhere, but I've been looking for it recently because I've been about to write about this. And of course, as is always the case, I can't immediately find it, though there are a variety of people I will ask, because I'm sure one of them will know. There was commentary at the time that Henry had greatly resented the fact that he had to give preference to his sister, that because she was a queen. But whether that's true or not, I don't think we absolutely know. I suppose one might always have a certain soft spot for a younger sister as opposed to an older one. But beyond that, I don't think there's a great deal of evidence one way or the other. There is some evidence in the way Henry actually treated his sister subsequently once she was in Scotland, and certainly during her husband's reign and after his death. Henry's relationship with Margaret was a rather difficult one. It is rather a classic case, I think, of sibling rivalry. But I think he probably had a softer spot for Mary because she was the sibling that he knew better, really, than his older sister.
Thank you very much to Beth Hunt and Al Pratt. I'm sorry I didn't mention your names when I asked that question. So now we're going to look ahead to Margaret's marriage to James IV of Scotland. And again, this is another question that we've got from Jody Field, asking if you could give us a little bit of insight into what the relationship was like between the two, but most specifically, if you could give us some information about several illegitimate children that he had, and did Margaret participate in their upbringing, and was the fact that he had so many illegitimate children, did it affect their marriage at all?
It doesn't seem to have in any very obvious way. Yes, James had quite a number of illegitimate children already by the time he married Margaret. I think it would be wrong to assume that she didn't know about this. One tends from sort of popular histories and historical fiction of the past to have this feeling that Margaret arrived in Scotland not knowing anything very much about her husband or his personal life prior to their marriage, or what sort of a man he was. I think that's very hard to believe. I imagine she had been briefed, perhaps albeit tactfully, by people who knew as to what she could expect when she got there. The only thing we do know, I don't think she played any part in their upbringing. James would have taken that upon himself. and a number of them were brought up with their mothers at any rate, though at the time that Margaret married James, a number of them were living in Stirling Castle, which was being used as a kind of de facto royal nursery for the illegitimate offspring. And as it was always the dower castle of Scottish Queen's consort, Margaret does seem to have insisted that these children be removed pretty quickly. She spent a fair amount of time always in Stirling Castle, which was clearly a residence that she liked very much. And if she did put her foot down, albeit perhaps not too heavily, James certainly responded with alacrity, and the children were removed and did not return there. So no, there's no evidence that she took any part in their upbringing, probably because not in all of the cases, but in the majority of cases, their mothers were still alive, and there was sufficient economic support from the king to bring them up as royal bastards, basically, which meant that you were a lot better off than perhaps most ordinary people. Her relationship with James of Scotland James IV of Scotland is an interesting one, because, of course, she was very young when she arrived as his wife. She was 13 when they actually married and had her 14th birthday a few months later. He treated her with a great deal of respect and affection, and certainly made sure that she had all the trappings and accoutrements of a queen consort. He wanted a woman who would do him justice as an appropriate consort to sit beside him on the Scottish throne. He gave her lands and money and jewels and all the magnificent sort of clothing that she wanted. But I think more than that, there is a great deal of evidence as the 10 years of their marriage progressed that he had successfully trained her in the role of queen consort. Now, her mother and grandmother had given her a very sound background in the roles of what a queen consort was expected to do. And certainly there was no great difference between that and between a queen consort of England and a queen consort of Scotland, except perhaps that a queen consort in Scotland, because of the way the Stuart monarchy functioned, was expected to be more visible and to accompany her husband on things like pilgrimages, which could be to any of the four corners of Scotland and involve a lot of travelling. And Margaret did travel a lot with James. And beyond that, of course, she was expected to produce children, which she did, though none of them lived until James V, who was born in 1512. I don't think that enough comparisons are made sometimes between the situation of James IV and Margaret Tudor in Scotland and Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon in England, because Margaret had had just as many sort of stillbirths, deaths of babies, miscarriages, etc., as her sister-in-law, or about the same at any rate. But the great difference was that Margaret was a lot younger than her husband, 17 years younger, in fact, whereas Catherine of Aragon was, of course, nearly 6 years older than Henry VIII. And in the balance of how this would pan out in terms of heirs, then it was certainly the case that Margaret produced a son who finally survived in James V, at a time when her brother did not have a male heir. And of course, during all the time that Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII were trying to produce children, his heir was Margaret Tudor. This, I think, made Henry uncomfortable, because it meant in practice that if he died, or even if one of their children died in childhood, which was quite likely, then the throne would pass to his sister on Henry VIII's death, and in practice her husband, who would certainly have had a major role to play in the government of England. So it is quite a tense situation. But I think James had trained Margaret very well for her role as his queen consort. He made sure that she looked the part, that she understood what was expected of her, that she played her role in the cultural and religious life of Scotland. Certainly, she referred to him in her letters to Henry VIII, in a way which leaves little doubt that it was a close working partnership and relationship. And James had sufficient confidence in her, of course, to leave her as regent for their son, were he to be killed or to die. And of course, that is precisely what happened, though it didn't necessarily, of course, pan out in the way that either of them would have anticipated subsequently. But if not a relationship of deep and passionate love, it was certainly one of mutual affection and respect, I think, and a tribute perhaps to both of them in the successful 10 years of their marriage, which, of course, sadly ended with a desperately anguished finality when James was killed at Flodden.
Well, I was going to focus some more on Margaret and James's marriage because we got to that portion. But now that we've touched a little bit on Catherine of Aragon, I'm just going to switch gears for a little bit and then we're going to come back to that. But I'm going to go to Rabid Monkey's question about Margaret's relationship with Catherine of Aragon. Given kind of what you said, their similar experiences with pregnancy and childbirth and things like that, did they talk to each other very often? Were they close? Or was this more, you live there, I live in Scotland? We're separate.
I don't think they were particularly close. Remember, Margaret had only met Catherine of Aragon briefly at Catherine's marriage to Prince Arthur. Catherine was in Ludlow when Arthur died, and certainly Margaret had not seen her since she left London in December 1501 to move with her husband to the Welsh Marches. And as far as I can recall, Catherine of Aragon didn't return to London until after Margaret Tudor had left for Scotland. So it would have been a very brief encounter then. Whether they communicated subsequently, again, we don't know. The interesting thing about this is that Margaret was the most prolific letter writer of any of the Tudor monarchs. She left behind a body of letters, which is far greater than that of any other monarch of the Tudor period. But many of her personal letters are probably lost. There could have been possibly, dozens, if not scores of others, but a ship rather, bringing many of the Scottish records down from Scotland to England during the interregnum, the period between the death of Charles I and the restoration of Charles II. This ship foundered and sunk with all of these documents on board. So a huge repository of knowledge and information was lost forever to us for that, which is very sad. And the letters of Margaret that survive are almost all in English sources. There are virtually none left in Scotland. We don't know whether they communicated at all during the period that Margaret was Queen in Scotland. I imagine they perhaps did so, though not necessarily very often, because their experiences and obligations would have been quite time-consuming. Even though Margaret was an inveterate letter writer, I think her husband would have asked, what she was writing about, probably. That isn't to say that she would have been barred from writing, but probably she didn't see a great deal of need, I would have thought, to keep in touch at that time. After Flodden, Catherine wrote her what I think most of us would consider to be an extraordinarily patronising and off-putting letter, sort of offering to send a friar up to comfort her. Catherine had said to Henry VIII, James IV got what he deserved. And this is kind of implicit in this, I'm so sorry for you kind of letter from Catherine. And we don't know how Margaret responded to it. We know that she did, though, because it's referred to in other sources, but what she actually said, which could have been shove off, get lost, we really don't know. I imagine it was more
That's fun to think about, though.
It was more tactful than that, I suspect. But anyhow, as far as we know, she declined the offer, having confessors and friars of her own that she could turn to for spiritual support. Whether this was Catherine of Aragon trying to be clever at her sister-in-law's expense, or whether it was genuinely something in which the woman was torn because she had been delighted by James IV's death but felt sorry for his widow, we don't really know. I mean, I have a certain admiration for Catherine of Aragon, but her behaviour over James IV's death is not particularly creditable, I think. And certainly after that, yes, when Margaret came down to England for her year and a bit, when she left Scotland in 1516, she did meet with Catherine of Aragon and her sister Mary, and they attended a number of spectacles and sporting events and things like that together. How close they were in practice, we don't know. Of course, in 1516, Catherine of Aragon herself gave birth to a child who would survive, Princess Mary, but not ever to a male heir that survived. Whereas Margaret had one and initially two in Scotland, her younger son, because Margaret was pregnant with another child when James IV was killed. It's perhaps possible that she didn't know when he set off for Flodden, but she would certainly have known that she was pregnant by the time that the battle took place and subsequently. But her younger son by James, Alexander, died at the age of just about 2, and Margaret was in England at the time and had not seen him for quite a while. But, I mean, crucially, she had produced the surviving male heir, whereas Catherine of Aragon had not. And even though there were hopes that further children would follow Princess Mary after 1516, there was a pregnancy, but it ended in either a miscarriage or a stillbirth. And after that, there were no more children. Of course, James V's tenure on the throne of Scotland as a toddler might have been viewed as at least rather problematic, but of course he did survive. So I think there was always that, perhaps that underlying tension between the sisters-in-law that, you know, I may have had to flee my country, and I'm not necessarily thrilled at the idea of going back, which was undoubtedly Margaret's point of view. But by the way, you know, I have produced a son who's a king, whereas you haven't got a male heir. And that kind of thing does make for tension, particularly in the early 16th century.
And back to your point, I think we're also used to the historical fiction representations that we have in our heads, that they, you know, fought and they were jealous of each other and all that kind of stuff. But it does let people ask us the questions so we can talk about it here, right? So
I don't think they had a lot of reason apart from the tension over perhaps, you know, who would produce the surviving male heir first. But beyond that, I don't think they had a lot of reason to be jealous of each other. I mean, they led entirely separate lives, and both would have been viewed by the outside world as well. Margaret's was tricky, of course, by the mid 15 teens. And Catherine's was not, of course, going to get any better, though it would be a long time before her marriage to Henry VIII finally fell apart. But I think there's just the distance in time and the different priorities of the two women, which would have meant they were not necessarily at daggers drawn, but they were not particularly close either.
So then we can come back around then to the point where we can ask things beyond just her relationships with her peers and such. But now, with regard to her marriage, there are speculations about when the marriage was actually consummated. So what do we know for sure about that? And is it true that James wore a cillis, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, a hair shirt around his waist that was missing after the battle?
Okay, there are various points mingled in there. Firstly, we don't know anything about the sexual details of Margaret and James's marriage, really anything more than we do of any other royal couple at the time. People didn't talk about these things. But I think there are two things to be distinguished, first of all, about the first part of the question. There is a difference between consummating a marriage and getting someone pregnant. which even in the 16th century, with all its rather backward and naive views of female gynecology, wasn't necessarily quite that stupid about what it took to get someone pregnant, and also how this could be avoided. I would think the marriage was almost certainly consummated shortly after the wedding in some shape or form, without going into huge detail as to what that might have been, because it wouldn't...
You can probably figure that part out.
Yes, you can figure that part out, yes. Because it wouldn't have been viewed as a proper marriage otherwise in religious law, you know, and it would have been open to the possibility of annulment if either party had chosen to at some point to make a fuss about it. Since that didn't happen, I would think the betting money would be that James certainly knew what he was doing with women. Sorry, not men. He doesn't seem to have been interested in men in the slightest. With women in bed, and I think you must give him credit for realizing that the marriage had to be consummated, but that this was a very young girl. And that getting her pregnant would really not be very clever, particularly as this had been brought home to him about as specifically as it could be in earlier letters from Henry VII, in which because James had been keen to have the marriage take place, you know, when Margaret was much younger, and Henry essentially said to him, look, come off it. My mother, who has a lot of experience of what happens when you marry too young, and my wife are just concerned that, you know, we're not going to send essentially a child bride to you. Now we can have a lot of arguments about whether a girl going north to her husband at the age of 13 is a child bride, and certainly in modern parlance she is. But in the royal families and aristocracies of Europe in early 16th century, she was not. And many people in those sort of social classes did marry very young. I mean, sometimes the boys were only 14 or 15 when they married. What was far less acceptable and happened far less was for the very young bride to become pregnant until she was at least in about the middle of her teens, because people did know that, you know, this could be avoided, and knew basically how to avoid it. Of course, you could get it wrong sometimes, but whereas Margaret Beaufort's husband, Edmund Tudor, had obviously been desperately keen to get her pregnant as soon as possible because it tightened his grip on her inheritance and her lands. I mean, it put him literally in control of her body and her finances in a much more concrete way. I mean, James IV didn't need that kind of reassurance with Margaret. He was already a king. And certainly Margaret did not give birth to her first child until she was 16, which was probably just as well, because she I don't know that her pregnancy was that difficult, but certainly the birth was pretty awful. And she only just about survived it. And James went on pilgrimage to the north of Scotland to give thanks at a shrine there for her survival. So she was very unwell after her first delivery, and seems to have been unwell in some of the subsequent deliveries as well. But she did her duty valiantly. After she was 16, she was pregnant most years until the birth of James V in 1512. And she seems to have been fertile enough, but the children either didn't survive or were stillborn and weren't carried to full term. And she had a variety of boys and girls, but only James V and then his younger brother Alexander, and subsequently, of course, in her marriage to the Earl of Angus, Margaret Douglas, they were the only ones who actually survived. But actually, having two surviving children to grow to adulthood, as she eventually did, was not a bad tally for those times. I mean, you could be pregnant umpteen times, but if you had, you know, 2 or 3 children who survived, who were healthy, then, you know, you were considered to have been successful, sadly enough. So in terms of the of whether the marriage was consummated, I mean, nobody knows, and certainly nobody would have spoken about it. I think you were supposed, to produce evidence on the bedding subsequently that something had taken place, but it probably would have been commented on. I mean, the only thing that we know is that the Somerset Herald, who'd accompanied Margaret on her journey north, did not, of course, go into any details about the wedding night, but said that, at the end of the wedding feast subsequently, the king had the queen apart and they went together. And that is all he said. He doesn't talk about any elaborate bedding ceremonies or Margaret being prepared by her ladies or anything like that. But I think you must assume that Margaret did not go up there wondering what on earth men and women did in bed. I think she would have known what to expect. And she and James seem to have handled it very well. As to the hair shirt and the belt stories, I mean, these appear in Scottish chronicles of the time. It was certainly said commented on that James sometimes wore a hair shirt. I don't know whether he wore it all the time. I mean, to be truthful, things like that didn't go very well under, cloth of gold and various other magnificent textiles that kings were supposed to wear. So the thought that he might have worn it daily, I think, is fanciful. The same thing probably applies to the iron belt. The iron belt story stems from the way that James IV came to the throne, which he did as a teenage rebel against his own father in 1488. And he had joined and been supported by a group of rebels who disliked the policies and the manner of rule of his father, James III of Scotland. And eventually they literally, came to fight it out. And James the Fourth had given orders that, his father was not to be harmed. But James was undoubtedly killed on the field of Sauchiburn in 1488, and appears to have been killed, perhaps trying to leave the battlefield, by person or persons unknown. All we know is that he was dead at the end of the battle, and that James IV, his son, who was 14 at the time, he was 15 shortly afterwards, does seem to have been genuinely remorseful. The iron belt may have been a bit of a PR exercise, if you see what I mean, but it probably did exist, and no doubt James wanted it known on certain occasions that he wore both it and the hair shirt. The concept that he wore this on a daily basis, I think, is bordering on the ridiculous, quite frankly.
Thank you, Techno, for that question, actually. And thank you for the answer, actually, because that's very helpful to understand the kind of PR aspect of it. That's funny that you worded it that way. So now the Tudor age asks us, given the record that Scottish regents had for ruling young monarchs, did Margaret truly believe that she would have been a good regent for James V?
I should have thought, if she looked back at what had happened to some of the Scottish monarchs in the 15th century, she would have had every reason to suppose that she could do at least as well, if not better. I mean, in order to answer this question, I will have to diverge briefly on what had happened prior to Margaret, because Scottish history is very complicated politically. It's often rather simplistically divided into sort of nasty, thuggish nobles and unfortunate children. And it is true that between between the early 15th century, when James I of Scotland came to the throne, and the year 1625, when Charles I became King of Scotland, no monarch had attained their majority by the time that they became king, or in Mary Queen of Scots' case, queen. And while it's all very well to be sort of horrified by the circumstances of Scotland and to rant and rail against the Scottish nobility, the sheer fact of the matter is that they held the country together for a hell of a long time, and did so perhaps with varying degrees of success. But I mean, more recently, there has been a move away from the, all Scots noblemen were thugs. I remember Professor Julian Goodare, who's Professor of History at the University of Edinburgh, saying to me when I was writing my book on the rivalry between the Tudors and the Stuarts, which is what ultimately, gave me the idea to write more about Margaret Tudor. Please do not portray the Scottish nobility as unprincipled thugs. Well, there is much more to them than that. And while some of them were unprincipled thugs, so were most nobility in that respect throughout Europe.
Aren't they all? Yeah.
Yes, it is not something unique to Scotland. However, James I had people who were ultimately supposed to rule on his behalf, and I think it's fair to say didn't. When he died, and of course he was murdered at Perth, largely because some of the Scottish nobility didn't like the way he was governing. I mean, he tried to wrest control back to the crown, which is something which is not surprising at the time. But the manner in which he did it enraged a number of influential people, and eventually he was murdered. And his son, James II of Scotland, was only a child of about 6 or so at the time. And his mother, the Englishwoman Joan Beaufort, ruled briefly as regent, but ran into some of exactly the same problems that Margaret Tudor was to run into. Firstly, she was English, and secondly, she was a woman. And also Margaret is often criticised for the way she behaved, but I mean, I think both she and Joan didn't have very much option, really. But Margaret didn't hold on to power for very long, though she sort of flitted in and out of Scottish politics for quite a long time afterwards. And then, of course, James III came to the throne as a child when his father went too close to a cannon at Roxburgh Castle and got unfortunately blown up for it. But although she was only briefly regent, James III of Scotland's mother, Mary of Guelders, who was, well, now we would say a Belgian princess, she was a niece of the Duke of Burgundy. She ruled briefly as regent, but ruled very well before her death. So she was a precedent that Margaret would have known of and been aware of. And subsequently, of course, James IV, when he came to the throne, didn't actually have regencies. He was king, but he had a council that advised him, and they trained him pretty well, I think. And eventually, he learned how to work with them, and they with him, and it made him one of the most successful and impressive of all Scottish monarchs. So I don't think there was necessarily that in the background of Scotland in the 15th century. Which would have made Margaret think that she couldn't do a good job of being regent. And I mean, for God's sake, this woman is a Tudor. They don't think in that kind of way. I mean, which Tudor monarch can you name to me who would think, I wonder if I can do this? I can't think of one, can you?
Definitely not. Definitely not. They're all pretty confident, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, it goes with the role and the training. And I think she thought, as indeed her husband thought, that he had prepared her against what would have seemed to both of them the unlikelihood of this role. But of course, James had put upon her the stricture which she eventually, and unwisely, there are reasons that she did it, I think, dispensed with. Which was that she would be regent for her son so long as she remained unmarried. And this wasn't unique to Margaret. I mean, this was the kind of stricture put on widowed queens because the difficulties that ensue from remarriage, James IV would obviously see. And while the Scottish nobility was difficult to deal with, I think most other female monarchs, female queen's consort, all queen's consort are female, Linda, all other queen's consort would have been subject to the same kind of restrictions. Now, why Margaret decided in the end that she could not live with that particular restriction is something which I am quite willing to talk about.
Well, that was a perfect little Scottish history lesson that I think we all love a good
Sorry.
tangent. So yes, no, we love it. That's perfect. That's what you're here for.
But one of the things
that's why you're the expert.
One of the things that struck me about the questions was that you can't answer some of them without knowing a bit more about the background of Scottish history, because it's not just personal relationships; it's the context in which these come to fruition and take place that explains quite a lot of what these people did, I think. And we do.
Sure, and in general, it's you can't really answer something about now without knowing what happened first, right?
No, or what else is going on around it, I think. I think one of the points I would make in general is that we do have a tendency now to think that the Tudors were just like us, but in fancy dress. And they were not just like us. Believe me, people, they were not just like us.
I certainly don't have that impression.
No, but some people do, I think. And I think it's perpetuated by historical novels and inaccurate films. I mean, some of anything that interests people in history is fine. But when it gives them such a sort of 21st century view of the past, then I think it does need to be corrected. And I think it's one of my roles as a historian to try and do that, but in an interesting rather than, you don't know what the hell you're talking about kind of way. So that's what I hope I might have done with my brief history lesson on 15th century Scotland, which might drive some Scots up the wall, incidentally. I hope it doesn't, because I think it was mostly right.
No, I think it was perfect. So then we're just going to stop listening to the historical novels and, inaccurate movies and stuff like you said. But when we're looking at her marriages, I feel like there's a lot of focus on that in all of the historical fiction, right, that we look at and we read and things like that. So Mary Lou writes in and asks us, which of her three husbands do you think that she had the most successful relationship with? And possibly furthermore, why do you think that she even entered into the second two?
It's a good question. I think without doubt the most successful and for her most satisfying of her marriages would have been that to James IV of Scotland. He was an extraordinary man, hugely learned, restlessly interested in all kinds of things new, cultured, a linguist. He understood his people very well. He knew about public image. He wanted to make Scotland more important in Europe, to make it all right, he knew it was a small and in many respects impoverished country, but he wanted to give it a place on the European scene. And in that he succeeded absolutely. And that was not lost with his death, despite the chaos and confusion that followed. So I think Margaret had been 10 years the wife of a quite extraordinary man, one of the great Renaissance kings of Britain. And to lose him suddenly must have been an extraordinarily difficult and traumatic thing to deal with, especially if you recall for a woman who was pregnant at the time. The marriage with Angus was undoubtedly a huge mistake. And although it's often criticised as, you stupid woman, why didn't you realise what this was going to happen? You were breaking the terms of your husband's will, etc. It is more complicated than that. And also, it's often overlooked, I think, that the marriage was a disaster on a personal level to Angus. I think within a matter of months, she realised that they simply, were going to fight a lot and didn't get along. You have to look at Margaret's circumstances at the time when she married the Earl of Angus, Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, in the summer of 1514. She had two small sons, one of whom was king and the other of whom would, of course, been the heir at the time, young as he was. She already knew that there had been moves amongst some of her councillors, despite their professing loyalty. There had already been moves and discussions to replace her as regent, whatever the terms of her husband's will were, by John Stuart, Duke of Albany, who had been born in France, was first cousin to James I, and was to James IV of Scotland, and was the nearest male heir. He didn't know anything about Scotland. I should doubt that he could speak Scots at all. He was certainly French speaking. I mean, it's often overlooked. I think one of the things, just to go back a little bit, is that Margaret in Scotland had to learn a different language. She didn't learn Scottish Gaelic, which her husband spoke. James IV was the last King of Scotland to speak Gaelic. But Margaret learnt Scots. Now, people in England would tell you that Scots is a dialect. People in Scotland would be offended by that, I think. And there is, I think, some move to reintroduce it in schools there. Believe me, if you have to read it, it ain't easy, but you can learn to read it. In fact, if you read it out loud, it's easier to sort of understand than if you just sit on a page looking at it. But I think, knowing that her situation was not secure, her pregnancy had somewhat sidelined her from politics anyhow, especially as it went on. She did attend quite a number of council meetings in the earlier phases of her pregnancy, but that grew more difficult later on. And of course, giving birth and then having to stay out of the public eye and all that until you were churched and everything, that took her away at a crucial period of time. And also, she could not be sure of the support of Henry VIII in any way. She couldn't be sure whether he would support her politically, whether he would support her financially, whether he would support her militarily. He hummed and hawed and blew sort of hot and cold about this. So, this is a woman in 1514 in quite a vulnerable situation. And what may have happened is not that she ran up panting after Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, thinking, cool, here's a good-looking young man. Incidentally, they were both the same age. So it isn't the kind of going after a younger man that used to be depicted in the past. They were both the same age, and they both lost a spouse. He was a widower and she was a widow. It isn't as simple as that. There is some inference from the surviving records and the timing of the marriage and the way the Douglas family behaved that they perhaps brought pressure on Margaret at a time that she was vulnerable and said, look, Your Majesty, if you want to be certain of your position here in Scotland for the future, here is a handsome and available, well, I don't know quite how handsome Angus was actually, but I think he was probably reasonably good looking young man. And through our family connections, we will be able to support you. It was a mistake. If Margaret had held her nerve, we don't know what would have happened. Whether ultimately she would have been given the old heave-ho by the Scottish Council, the Lords in Council, and John Stuart would have been brought over anyhow. But the marriage to Angus precipitated the arrival of John Stuart, Duke of Albany. It wasn't universally supported by the Scottish Lords, incidentally. Margaret had a body of support all of the time and subsequently of people there who did espouse her cause, but they were outnumbered by people who had, I think, always thought that this wasn't a fit rule for a woman, particularly one with two small children, though, of course, queens did not bring up children in the personal way that mothers do now in those days. But I think it was a combination of factors, and not just the fact that this is a silly, empty-headed young woman who sort of has seen another man and thinks, wouldn't it be nice to be married to him? This is the stuff of historical ignorance and historical fiction. And I think one might well ask, what would you have done in that situation, which is a very difficult question for any of us to answer. That it was a mistake, Margaret knew very quickly, of course, as I said, not just for political reasons, but also for personal ones. And she spent the period between 1514 and 1528 regretting it bitterly and moaning about it a good deal to her her brother, Henry VIII, who ultimately, of course, in his classic way of not quite knowing what to do about Scotland, sided with Angus against Margaret, which caused Margaret a great deal of displeasure and anguish, as you can imagine. So it's very easy to be clever and say this is a silly, shallow woman who married for personal pleasure where Angus is concerned. It is much more complicated than that. As far as the third marriage to yet another Stuart, almost everyone in Scotland had some relationship to a person with the surname of Stuart. Henry Stuart, who Margaret seems to have begun an affair with in sort of 1526 to 1527, by which time her marriage to Angus had broken down irretrievably, despite the occasional attempt on her side to resurrect it. I mean, what was she to do? Her husband had spent all her money, had denied her lands and her incomes and rents from them. Women, even those with the title of Queen, were in a very difficult position in those days when it came to managing their finances. All of which Margaret might have been able to do better, I agree, had she remained unmarried. And of course, the one example of what she might have done, though you can hardly follow the example of someone who, comes after you, is Mary of Guise, who didn't become regent for her daughter until 1556, years after Mary had come to the throne, but who managed to maintain a role as the Queen's mother and the person who would bring up this child, and of course carefully manoeuvred to have her sent to France when she was 4.5. That did keep Mary of Guise in an influential role in Scotland, but of course times had changed by then. That kind of gamble seems to have been one that Margaret Tudor either didn't consider or didn't think would work. But by the time she married her third husband, Henry Stuart, for which she eventually got a papal dispensation, much to her brother Henry VIII's horror. This was not a way that people should behave, even at the time that he was starting to think of getting rid of Catherine of Aragon. I mean, his hypocrisy is almost breathtaking in the way that he wagged his finger at his sister over this sort of thing. But Margaret had, the third marriage was a marriage, I think, of infatuation on her side. I suppose by that time she was nearly 40. She had the justification of thinking that she might be happy. Henry Stuart, who later became Lord Mevern, was a member of her household, and seems to have risen high in her esteem and affection. He also betrayed her, of course, with another woman eventually. So it has to be said, I would agree, that when left to her own devices, Margaret did not make good choices in the matter of husbands. But certainly in the case of Angus, there are reasons for it that many people have been unwilling or unable to acknowledge in the past.
I think at this point we have sufficiently exhausted the details of all of her relationships with the people around her. So I'm going to switch gears now, not ask anything about the relationships, but we're going to take a look at the portrait that we see when we tweet. Actually, the one that I used when we tweeted out looking for questions for today. So all you really have to do, I apologize, I don't actually know who the artist was, but if you do a quick just Google search of Margaret Tudor, you'll see her holding a monkey. Is this significant in any way? Or, you could even just say, oh no, she just needed to put her hands on something. So what was the significance of her and the monkey in the picture?
It's not significant in any symbolic way. It's a marmoset, I think. It's a sign of wealth and power and status. Royal families in Europe, not just in Scotland or even just in England, had a particular interest in exotic pets at the time. This goes on well into the 17th century, incidentally. I don't think it stopped in Britain until about the time of the Hanoverians. But, lions at the Tower of London and all this sort of thing. Because these pets were so exotic and so expensive, it was a sign of who you were. And that you could afford a marmoset, which was a fairly rare monkey, I think, at the time, even amongst, the populace of monkeys then in royal houses in Europe. And it says, look at me, I'm a Queen of Scotland, and I can afford to have this pet. And it says a great deal about the wealth and the prestige of the Stuarts. The painting you're referring to, Steph, is actually a copy by the Dutch artist Daniel Meitens of a painting that is now lost, as far as we know. The painting itself is 17th century and is a copy. There's one of James IV, which is also painted by Meitens and which is also a copy, in which he's holding a hawk. He was, like many men at the time, he loved hawking and hunting with birds. And there may even have been a matched set, his wife with the perhaps slightly more female pet, though Margaret liked hunting and riding as well, and the king, her husband, with a hawk. And that is, it doesn't really symbolise anything more about the Stuart monarchy other than that they had taken their place at the centre of Europe, they hoped, by being able to demonstrate that they had exotic pets too.
Well, our last question now comes from Into Light, and they just wanted to know if there are any private things of Margaret's in any museums anywhere. I know that I almost brought this up earlier when you were talking about how all her letters were gone with the ship, I think that you said, all the letters that she had read.
Well, perhaps all her private letters. I mean, there are over 100 more official letters that survive, as I said, more than any other Tudor monarch, in fact. But I mean, the thing that I would point you to, I think, is her Book of Hours. As you probably know, most monarchs at that time, pre the Reformation, had a religious book which contained, stories and passages of the gospel. The most famous Book of Hours is the magnificent one of the Duc de Berry in France. That's earlier in the medieval period. A Book of Hours was commissioned by James IV as a present for his wife. I've seen a facsimile copy in the British Library, which is quite impressive to look at. The original is in Vienna now, in a museum there. I think how it got there by a very circuitous route is an interesting story. I'm not exactly certain how it did, but it did end up there. So that, as far as I can remember, is the only artefact actually connected with Margaret Tudor that I know of. I could check. I could check the thesis of Dr. Helen Newsome, who's done a huge amount of work on Margaret's letters, examining them and looking at them from various linguistic as well as political and historical points of view. In which she's found a very different woman from the sort of oversexed whinger who is only interested in her wardrobe that is often presented and has been in the past as our definition of Margaret Tudor. I mean, here is a woman who was still prominent in Anglo-Scottish relations and diplomacy well into the 1520s and 30s, and did play a role and understood, perhaps in a way that no one else could, the kind of priorities on both sides. And of course, Margaret was interested in dresses and jewellery, not just because this is a kind of girly thing, for God's sake. If you were a female monarch who wasn't interested in that sort of thing, you wouldn't have probably lasted very long. It was the visible aspect of your queenship. And to poke fun at someone because of this, I think is really a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of queenship at this particular period of our history. As a brief aside, I would say that I don't think people get this still, because I gave a talk some years ago now on as part of I was a guest speaker at a historical tour that was organised by Alison Weir. And I sat next to a young American lady, I have to say, at the dinner subsequently, and sort of was making conversation and saying, what have you been doing? You know, what have you heard and all that? And she said, oh, well, this afternoon there was a talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, jewels and dresses, but I'm not interested in that kind of thing. And I thought, more fool you. You don't get it, do you? I didn't say that to her, you'll be pleased to hear.
Oh, I would have liked to hear the rest of it if you did say that to her.
I think I probably mumbled into my glass of wine and point out to her that actually this was rather important at the time, and it's a shame she missed it. Because in fact, the woman who gave the talk is an absolute expert on this kind of thing. And it did make me wonder, you know, whether anything had sunk in on this tour, at least with this particular person. But, you know, it is absolutely unfair to the point of ignorance, I'm afraid, to have a go at Margaret Tudor because all she was worried about was what she wore and what had happened to her jewels. These were what made her, in the public image, a queen.
Yeah, it sounds like you just needed maybe one more glass of wine and then you could have said it.
No, I think Alison would have been displeased. It's not the role of guest speakers under these sort of things to offend the guests.
Fine, all right.
Merely to point out to them as subtly as possible that they might perhaps just be missing something. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us, if our listeners wanted to find you, or learn more, or read your books, or anything like that, how can we do that?
Well, my books, I think all of them, all 5 of them, are still available on Amazon. I'm probably in bookshops. My current book, because of course for my last 2 books, I moved into the Stuart period. I'm now moving back with Margaret because, well, there are various things I won't go into here, but I decided that she was a very good topic, and I thought that, you know, a publisher would want to publish her, and I was correct about that. I mean, one of the things you learn over the years as a historian writing for a more general audience is that you do learn what publishers want, and no amount of announcing that, you know, you've got a brilliant idea and all these, you know, family documents and all that. I mean, publishers will go, yeah. But if they don't think it's going to sell, they won't buy it. And I think a lot of would-be writers and would-be historians as well, it is a hard truth, but it is one you have to accept. I'd actually wanted to write about Marie Antoinette because I was originally a historian of the French Revolution, but I couldn't interest a publisher in this country in her. There was a bit more interest in the US, but in the US now they all desperately want you to write a sample chapter, even though you've published 5 books. And I'm sorry, but, you know, I haven't published 5 books in order to write a sample chapter for someone else. I'm just not going to do that. So any publishers listening to this can put that in their pipes and smoke it. And having had that rant, which may be interesting to other people, my latest book, Mistresses, Sex and Scandal at the Court of Charles II, which has got more about sex in it than one can ever possibly write about Margaret Tudor and James IV, that is available online. It isn't available in the US because American publishers seem to think that people won't buy books on the Stuarts, which I'm told by many American people who bought my other books is a load of old rubbish, but, you know, in which case they need to tell publishers that, because publishers won't listen to me about it. But you can get it. You certainly could order it from the book depository here, and there wasn't even an international shipping charge. That was partly because of lockdown and COVID. I don't know whether that's still the case, but I think if you look on the internet, you can find that book. My 3 Tudor books, my first 3 books are certainly still available. My book on the rivalry between the Tudors and the Stuarts is called Crown of Thistles in England, and came out with a horrible title of Tudors versus Stuarts in the US, which made it sound like a football match. But again, as a writer, you don't have any control over that. If you can, I would buy the British version because it's better printed and it's got nice colour pictures in it. But, you can get these books if you look around. I am on Twitter. It's at Dr. Linda Porter 1. I've no idea who Dr. Linda Porter is, incidentally. I must look her up sometime. She's probably a medical doctor, I suspect, somewhere. But she obviously exists, or I wouldn't have been Dr. Linda Porter 1 by the time I got around to it. I'm on Facebook as well. In general, I suppose, and I have an entry on Wikipedia and everything. So I am out there. In the last year, I've done a lot of, not a lot, but a number of virtual talks. And I would have to say, Steph, quite honestly, that particularly at the time of COVID, but also perhaps in the future, I, like a number of other people, have found virtual talks and this kind of, podcast much easier to do than travelling, 500 miles up to Edinburgh to give a talk. It's very nice to be face-to-face with people, though one does get asked some rather strange questions from time to time in these public talks. For example, the first time I gave a talk on Mary, Queen of Scots, the first question was, did I know whether Diana, Prince of Wales, was a descendant of hers? Which completely floored me.
Oh,
it had nothing to do with anything I had said. And to be honest, I didn't know. So I do like giving face-to-face talks, but it just goes to prove how flexible we are now, that we can do this sort of thing, and you can do it over different time zones and in different countries. And although it is nice to interact with people, it's also rather a relief sometimes to be able to sit in your own study and do the kind of thing we've just done. So thank you very much for asking me.
Oh, of course. We're so happy to have you, and I'm happy that you enjoyed yourself. And I apologize on behalf of all the other American U.S. publishers who I'm severely unimpressed with at this point.
Not podcasters, I have to say.
No, not podcasters. Not podcasters.
They're quite different.
Right. I have no publishers on here with me, though, so I feel like I have to apologize for them. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please show your support by leaving a review wherever you listen. Reviews are some of the greatest gifts that you can leave a podcaster because it suggests their show to people who may not have even known it existed. So thank you so much for your support.
Thanks for checking out the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Read more on the blog at tudorsdynasty.com. Follow Tudors Dynasty on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Subscribe to Tudors Dynasty on iTunes. Thanks for listening.